Palestine solidarity has really shaped a kind of very much a resurgent form of labour internationalism, and I think that has been a really significant element.
If you could recall a moment, maybe, where the sea played an unexpected role in shaping a solidarity struggle.
It's not just a solidarity that is about a kind of symbolic solidarity, though that's obviously really, really important, but it's a solidarity that really impacts. And I think sometimes that can be romanticized, that just because people are thrown together, they kind of automatically produce some kind of solidarity.
Hello and welcome to Insurgency, a podcast about the oceans fighting back. The seas are rising and so are the people. We are here in Beirut. It is a podcast about that sails the rebellious waves of the global south with the help of our friends and colleagues around the world. We explore how communities are turning the tides through survival, solidarity and defiant mobility, and in an era where the oceans are no longer just a backdrop to history, but a contested frontier of power and possibility. I'm very delighted today to have as a guest to the podcast a good friend, I might say, if I'm allowed to say, and colleague, Dr. Professor, actually David Featherstone, at the University of Glasgow. I will introduce Professor Featherstone impressive also work in a bit, but before I wanted also to introduce my co-host here with me, Chris. Chris is a student of economics, and he's also a student who has been working with us all this year with the Insurgency Mapping Project. Chris Kabakyan, right?
Yes.
So welcome, Chris, and
Thank
welcome, David. I'm also very thankful to the AUB crew behind the cameras for helping making this podcast such a wonderful experience. Also to Rua Shakarun, who's been helping us to bring together all the logistics, but also some crucial interventions. So there are many people actually behind the cameras that make this podcast happen. Float, if you wish. So, and last but not least, of course, our host here at IFI, at Issam Fares Institute. We are at the 5th floor of the Issam Fares Institute at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon. So, Professor Featherstone is a professor of political geography in the School of Geographical and Earth Sciences at the University of Glasgow. His research is on political geographies of globalization, resistance, and solidarity, the relations between space and politics. We're very excited to talk about this from a geographical point of view. His work has been impressive. He has 2 books, mainly on subaltern political ecologies and the formation of transnational solidarity networks, on labor struggles, and also across, actually, labor struggles across the oceans. His first book, Resistance, Space and Political Identities, The Making of Counter-Global Networks, in 2009, is a sustained attempt to theorize resistance and political identities through utilizing a relational approach to space. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Yeah.
And his second book on solidarity, called Solidarity, Hidden Histories and Geographies of Internationalism, by Z Books, which was also, I think, very successful publication, very useful to me for sure to think about solidarity in this context. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Thank you.
We are very excited to have you on board.
Likewise.
So I'm gonna ask Chris to ask the first question. I think he has actually a very good question. That's why we start with Chris's question. So let's see how it goes. Chris.
So thank you, Professor Nicholas, and very happy to meet you, Dr. David.
Likewise.
And I just wanted to kick off the podcast with this question that really intrigued me. That you're based in Glasgow, which is a city with a strong tradition of international solidarity. And I wanted to ask that, how do you see today's Palestine solidarity protests, and especially in Glasgow and in the United Kingdom, like student encampments and port blockades, and connecting with the kind of struggles that you wrote about in your book, which is Solidarity, Hidden Histories, and Geographies of Internationalism?
So I think one of the things to say, I think at the outset is what's been happening in Glasgow and other cities and around the UK over the last few years, in terms of Palestine solidarity, has really built on that kind of history and has drawn kind of inspiration from what has gone before in various ways. So if we think about Glasgow's maritime histories and maritime solidarities, there's a kind of range of things there. So Glaswegian seafarers, for example, were involved in kind of maritime solidarities during the Spanish Civil War, for example, and attempting to support the Spanish people against Franco. There's also important histories in terms of Chile, seafarers boycotting Chilean ships, but more particularly in Liverpool, because that was where the Pacific Steamship Navigation Company ships to Chilean ports used to go regularly. But there's that history, and also, although it's not strictly kind of maritime, in Glasgow, or kind of just south of Glasgow, in 1974 in East Kilbride, workers at the Rolls-Royce plant there refused to work on engines for 8 Hawker Hunter jet engines that were sent from Pinochet's regime in Chile to be refurbished. And particularly that latter organising has been very influential, but was also, I think, when I first came to Glasgow, you didn't hear so much about that. I actually heard it read about it in a book by Andy Beckett. But there's a very powerful film, They Pass Around, which talks to some of the people who were involved in that action at East Kilbride. And so if you go to demonstrations now, so I was most recently we had the annual May Day March. So if you go to protests, you will hear people reference things like the boycott of the Chilean engines in relationship to Palestine solidarity, and also, and I think one of the things that's been important in Glasgow over the last few years has been the significant and I think really sustained presence of demonstrations in terms of Palestine solidarity. So it's not just been that there's been kind of one-off demonstrations every 6 months or so, but it's been very sustained. And also key sites in the city have been targeted. Both have been encampments at our university and kind of sustained engagement with the university's links to companies like Thales. But more generally, there's been a lot of action around the Thales plant in Govan. That's been ongoing over many years, but has been really kind of been a kind of significant target of demonstrations and solidarity actions. And I think one of the things to also signal in that respect is that the increasingly authoritarian political culture in the UK has been disproportionately targeted at Palestine solidarity. So people who've been involved in those demonstrations at Thales have been arrested. There's been also other kind of harsh protesting of other harsh policing, of some of the protests. So I think sometimes I think when people look back on solidarity, when people look back, say, on the anti-apartheid movement in Glasgow, people position that as if it was a consensual act that everybody was in favour of. But actually, I think it's really important to look back in those struggles, that they weren't things that everybody agreed with, and to kind of make a stand on them was a kind of a significant political act. In my solidarity book, I tell a story about a friend of mine, Kenny Caird, who was singing, and this also gives you a sense of some of the kind of more sort of ways in which solidarity is woven into the sort of some of the political culture in Glasgow. So he was a folk singer, and he sang one night a song called Ravonia that was written by Hamish Henderson, the Scottish folklorist and singer. Interestingly, so it's about the Ravonia trial, when people like Mandela and Walter Sisulu were imprisoned on Robben Island. Interestingly, that song is set to a tune linked to the Spanish Civil War, but Kenny was got into trouble for singing that song because 4 white South Africans walked out of the bar he was singing in. It was just by the youth hostel. The bar staff were pissed off with Kenny that he was losing them custom. So I think it's important to think about this sort of re-scripting later of solidarities as some things that are kind of consensual. People obviously wanted to line up and get selfies with Mandela down the line, and I think that's important to remember in the current context where there is a kind of authoritarian kind of repression of solidarities with Palestine, that this has been something that has faced significant pushback, and shamefully and that has continued under and even been ramped up under Starmer's Labour government.
David, that's fascinating, at the same time also extremely enraging and kind of depressing. But your work has been very much about labor organizing, and especially across the global South. But you also make fascinating connections between global North labor and global South networks. Yeah. So how does that look like today? You know, how is labor organizing? Especially in relationship to Palestine, but also beyond Palestine today, is we go through extremely harsh, repressive, as you said, times, not only in terms of solidarity, but also in terms of labor solidarity among themselves, union busting, right? There's a lot of that, I guess, in the UK. So can you give us a sense of the contemporary situation at the labor, especially also maritime labor, port workers, and how does the sea and the wild conditions that are somewhat present at maritime networks of labor and shipping play out on that level? Yeah.
So I think there's a kind of number of things to kind of raise. I think one thing in terms of to signal from the outset in terms of things like the movement for boycott, divest and sanctions is that was something that was shaped by Palestinian unions. That Palestinian agency is really important in positioning that movement. So it's not just that movements elsewhere have decided to be in solidarity with what's going on in Palestine, but those connections are important. So I think that is kind of one key aspect of these solidarities in terms of those global North-South dynamics. And I think, and that's perhaps also kind of put pressure on some of the unions in the global North that have tended to be a bit more, cautious as well. And I think, so another element that I think is really important in terms of what you're talking about in terms of those kind of maritime spaces is the sort of the networked elements of that trade. So again, linking back to the May Day rally, there was interesting speakers from the Palestine youth movement, and they were talking about campaigns around Maersk and recent actions against Maersk by French and Moroccan dockers. And I think that gives a sense of how dockworkers, particularly, and Peter Cole writes about this a lot in his really important book, Dockworker Power, have agency to really shape and challenge global flows. And you wrote this about this yourself in terms of the kind of solidarities of dockworkers in Italy. So you've got those abilities to really cut into and disrupt and signal that this kind of global trade support is the Israeli state is not something that people across the world support. And I think that's a kind of very powerful and disruptive aspect of those kind of solidarities. It's not just a solidarity that is about a kind of symbolic solidarity, though that's obviously really, really important, but it's a solidarity that really impacts on the kind of flows of kind of munitions or kind of other kind of things that are important. So I think that's important to kind of to bear in mind. I think that's the third thing to kind of signal is the real kind of racialized and precarious nature of maritime work. And obviously that's also meant that, say, in a city like Glasgow, the kind of maritime labour market has massively shifted over the last 50 or 60 years. And I think that both represents possibilities, but also difficulties for maritime organising. Say in the UK, the dominant seafarers union, the National Union of Seamen, had a history actually as a very corrupt and problematic organisation, but there was also a set of struggles to democratise it in the kind of 60s, well, or in basically the post-war period. But that and that was important in getting that union to engage with Chile Solidarity and anti-apartheid organising. That union would not have officially been involved in that if those processes hadn't happened. But then the kind of UK maritime labour market basically fell apart in that period, and the NUS was also a pretty kind of chauvinistic union. Even some of the folk on the left kind of landed that way, though some of the folk on the left didn't. But so there was there's tensions between the kind of ways in which a kind of global maritime labour market functions now, and also how that kind of precarity is used to really undercut the kind of both the conditions of workers, but there are also possibilities for intervening in things. But I think one of the important aspects of that is that the maritime workers in various places, despite those harsh conditions, still manage to organise and mobilise, which I think is really, really important.
I remember your book. Excuse me. I remember your book mentioning that very clearly. You know, the Solidarity book about how racism practically among labourers in the global north, right, has been an impeding force in organising and in solidarity, and how that is being even reinforced today. So at the same time, I think one can say safely that maritime labour is the first internationalized and internationalist labour, right? Compared to the later, of course, nowadays mixed labour regimes, even in the global north, where you have, of course, these questions and these problems, as you said, of division and chauvinism in all labour practically fields throughout, right, the global north. But how do you find that the spatiality then? How does the sea bears its mark on labour conditions? Is it more a divider, or is it, you know, a unifier of labour solidarity? Is there a way that we can actually have a general statement about that? Or everything is a bit more complicated, of course, than that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's partly a bit more complicated, but I also think there is a really important way in which the sea and kind of spaces like ships and docks in Doreen Massey's terms, like throw people together. And I think sometimes that can be romanticized, that just because people are thrown together, they kind of automatically produce some kind of solidarity. But at the same time, so I think there can, under those conditions, particularly as you kind of talk about in, say, the public culture paper, with the kind of entrenched nature of kind of racial capitalism at sea as well, that can kind of work to kind of foster division. But I think those spaces can also enable really important forms of connection. So, for example, if you look at some of the Chile solidarity that happened in the 70s in Britain, people involved in the Seafarers Union in ports like Liverpool, they knew dockers in Chile, they knew other seafarers, and from so it means that there's some of those slightly more kind of organic connections, that some of those seafarers and dockers solidarities, they're not necessarily, obviously organisations like the International Transport Workers Federation have been important, but it can also be those more sort of grassroots connections and solidarities, sort of internationalism from below, that kind of can be shaped through maritime spaces. So Peter Linebaugh talks about the ship as a sort of forcing house of internationalism. And I think I think it can be stretched too far if you kind of think about this as a general rule. But if you're kind of forced together in a particular space, there can be conditions where you just have to get on with people and kind of work with people. There can be ways. Someone like Ravi Ahuja, who's just written a really interesting book on South Asian seafarers working in relationship to UK shipping in the early 1920s. He really traces those very intense racialized divisions of labour that were on UK on ships under British imperialism. So there were kind of tensions there, but there were also, I think, interesting things that emerged. So one of the things I've been trying to get a handle on recently, over the last few years, and this has kind of been slow kind of work. In the 1950s, when and late 40s, there were seafarers from Liverpool who were mostly from Irish background. They were smuggling publications between Liverpool and Georgetown in Guyana and had links with figures like Chidi Jagan, the key anti-colonial leader in Guyana. And this is at a time when the British imperialists are trying to hold on to Guyana. They engineer a coup in 1953 after Jagan wins the People's Progressive Party wins the kind of first semi-democratic elections there. So there were these kind of interesting sort of histories of connection, and I think that's really important to show that whilst there are kind of, I think it's really important to recognise that there were kind of really important histories of pre-racist actions by various trade unions, whether that be in the UK, the US or Australia, for example, that there's kind of really important counter stories to them as well.
Cool. I mean, I have to say that we emailed Peter Linebaugh for this podcast. I'm still waiting to hear from him. I hope we're going to get him to talk to us.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, he's been somebody who's inspired me since he was a big inspiration for my PhD going back at least a year. No, I've been reading his work since I was a student, and it's been really important to me.
I identify.
Yeah.
Chris?
Yes, thank you, Professor. And I've been also meaning to ask you, given your big experience in such solidarities, I wanted to ask if you could recall a moment, maybe, where the sea played an unexpected role in shaping a solidarity struggle. So maybe a port blockade, a shipping route, or a maritime protest.
I mean, I think one of the one really important example of this is comes from Heather Goodall's work, where she talks about the important role that Indian seafarers or other South Asian seafarers who were based in Australian ports in the kind of mid to late 1940s were significant in shaping and supporting struggles for Indonesian independence. So, and that was also kind of solidarities that were shaped by a kind of broader sort of leftist infrastructure in Australian ports. So my friend David Kelleher talks about the importance of infrastructures of solidarity, and so different spaces in Australia, quite some, not all, maritime spaces that were linked to the Communist Party there were kind of important in shaping these sort of different interconnections, which had quite significant impact in blocking Dutch ships going to Indonesia. So that's a really interesting story of that kind of internationalist solidarity, and one that where there's quite a lot of different geographies at work.
But David, I want to ask about that exactly. Way of talking about solidarity. It seems that all the times, we have to go back in time, right, to find these examples. Does that mean that today's situations are extremely difficult, given, for example, the automation, the containerization, the securitization of ports? Ports are not anymore what they used to be. They are much more kind of securitized zones with fences and cameras, and the sailors cannot even get off boats. I mean, it goes extremely fast, fast logistics to board, to offload and unload, and eventually they just, the idea we have about the port has totally shifted today. Ports are practically militarized spaces that do not allow for any of this kind of interaction that you nicely described so far. So I'm wondering if this is a story of the past, and it will remain the story of the past, all of this interesting and definitely fascinating solidarity connections. How does that play out today, in today's landscape, which is much different, right, by all means?
Yeah, I think the other thing to mention is also, I'd say in certainly in UK port cities, the ports have generally also been moved out of the centre of the city, so that they're much less visible than they were. So I think that also kind of feeds into this sense that we're kind of ports providing that sort of invisible kind of infrastructure for kind of global trade and global capitalism. So I think you're right that there's certainly been a pushback in terms of these kind of conditions making kind of organising harder. But I think it's also clear that organising is still going on. It's still possible, and I think it makes the fact that dock workers, whether that be the Indian Port Workers Union, who released a pretty significant statement in terms of solidarity with Palestine, or kind of dock workers targeting MES, for example, they're still enabling unions, enabling that organising to have an impact. I think the flip side of that kind of automation and things like that, and this is something that people like Jeremy Anderson from the International Transport Workers Federation have talked about, is there are also vulnerabilities of that automation, of that kind of logistics hubs, and that's spatiality as well. So it's not just that if things are restructured in that way, that it doesn't come without possibilities for kind of other forms of organising. But I think the other thing to kind of mention, allied with that, is and I kind of mentioned this in terms of the the discussion at the start around Starmer and the kind of repression of Palestine solidarity protests here and elsewhere is obviously, it's a kind of moment where we've got kind of weaker unions, where there's kind of a kind of entrenchment of kind of more authoritarian political cultures, and that's clearly something that's difficult space for organising as well.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, definitely, this is coming from from the region here. Things are quite harsh and and difficult, to say the least, at the labor level for sure. And we are also witnessing how ports have been.
Exactly.
Have been sites of contestation, if not, in fact, also militarization to the nth degree. And also war. So how would you see the parallels between all the maritime struggles and today's struggles, and how does the sea today might also, as you said, there are also openings. These systems of automation, the whole idea that every minute matters, the logistics that are extremely high tech today. All the systems, they also have weak points. At least they have points where they can be somewhat seen as points of contestation, right? I mean, we see that happening today in Yemen, for example, where geography plays a role, and I think that you definitely have thoughts about that. So how these weak points, if you wish, the bottlenecks, or even the weak points in terms of automation, do you have some specific cases where we can definitely see that happening today? Where the weak points or the points of contestation can become politicized, and they can become entry points for the struggles that you're talking about. Yemen is definitely something that highlights that quite clearly.
No, I think it's clearly a kind of a good example. I mean, you'll know more about the specifics of what's going on there than me. I think in terms of that kind of broader question, in terms of the kind of links and the kind of resonances between past and present, is that I think one thing is that the different companies or different kind of imperial kind of powers still depend on labour to kind of move things and that kind of infrastructure, and that is absolutely dependent on kind of workers that they can't necessarily control all the time. So I think that's one of those openings. And I think if we look back, say, in the 30s, when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, particularly workers in the Caribbean and in different parts of Africa, but also in ports like Cardiff, were involved in disrupting the kind of munitions trade to Italy and Ethiopia to kind of put pressure on that fascist colonial project there. So I think there's clearly resonances with what's going on today in terms of that kind of longer kind of history of opposition to imperialism and to targeting kind of maritime trade as one key way of putting pressure on imperial kind of states. And I think, as you say, what's going on in Yemen is one good example of that. Would you
have a region or a kind of direction, a geographical direction where we'd say, okay, things are better in terms of labor organizing there, because, for example, I can tell you that in our region, of course, as you know, political repression has been quite successful at all levels. But we saw Moroccans mobilizing a few weeks ago So which was a very interesting and very surprising element. But generally speaking, since you also talk about the global links and the global connections, would you just identify a region where things are a bit more, optimistic than the overall? I mean, I'm sure that Europe is not really at the top of this list right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also, as you say, talking from root, I think it's also important to kind of, while I've been talking about the sort of authoritarian political culture in Britain, obviously I recognise that that's a different level of what's going on than in somewhere like the conditions that you're experiencing or elsewhere. So I'm not trying to kind of suggest that things are kind of flat in that regard. Yeah, I think at the moment it's difficult to kind of necessarily put a finger on kind of areas that are kind of particularly progressive. Obviously, South Africa's played a really important role in leading a kind of a more international campaign to things like the International Criminal Court, and I think that's also partly pushed by that kind of longer term kind of solidarity from below that we've seen in ports like Durban in terms of targeting ships in terms of Israel as well there. So I think there's kind of important kind of elements of that pressure which come from below rather than it just being a kind of state project as well.
So you do again identify, I guess, global south in South Africa, but also I guess South Asia, right? There is some mobility there. There's some movements there. And even South Europe to an extent,
exactly.
Within this geography, the geographies of solidarity today.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because I think that kind of disrupts, but also disrupts the sense that solidarities are limited to kind of north-south dynamics, but also kind of builds on those longer-term histories and geographies of solidarity, and also is important about how we remember particular forms of solidarity. So if we think about the anti-apartheid movement, for example, it's often storied through those key heroic figures like Mandela, who obviously are pivotal and important, but some of that more kind of grassroots mobilisation among, say, dockworkers in ports like Durban that Peter Cole and others talk about is a really important and often a bit neglected aspect of that story, and I think it's important in terms of drawing out those kind of transnational connections, and also as you signal your piece on Greek shipping and racial capitalism, you've also got like in Bandung, you've got those kind of and Shemaine Chewis kind of talked about this, the important kind of ways in which a challenge to imperial shipping is in there, and in the rights of people from around that time, people like Nkrumah as well. So there's kind of interesting lineages there of targeting shipping and trying to think about a challenge to imperial shipping.
I have one more question, and then I'll.
Go ahead.
Chris, may I? I just had to ask this question because I asked about regions. I just want to ask about unions. I mean, can you give us a sense of what's happening with the trade unions at the global level? I know that there's some interesting stories. You also contributed to the story of International Transport Union, right? Workers Union. What is the situation today? How would you describe it? Is it also reflective of the general atmosphere conditions that you mentioned at the beginning? Which is rather grim, or are there also different kinds of conditions according to which union and which which region? Can you give us a sense a little bit of that, and then?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to give a kind of overview like that. I think in terms of trying to answer that, in clearly that the kind of pressures that unions are kind of under is significant. But I also think there's been a certain revitalisation going on in various places, just to kind of perhaps go back to a UK example, in the early 2020s, we had a pretty significant strike wave here. And one of the things that was interesting was that you had people like Mick Lynch, who's the leader of the rail and maritime and transport workers here, and they were able, I think, to put across arguments in quite a kind of in quite an effective and populist in the best sense of that term way, and that's shifted the kind of terms on which some of their sort of anti-trade union rhetoric has been happening. So for example, one of my favourite interviews, he was very good at kind of pushing back at various interviews like from Sky and things like that. So one of my favourite things was where he was like being asked by Kate, I think it was Kate Lilly from Sky, it might have been someone else. Like he's been interviewed outside a picket line of railway workers, and they're kind of basically accusing him of being part of a kind of militant mob of pickets and stuff like that. And he's saying, look, the pickets are behind me, this is what they do. You couldn't see them. And it was just very, rather than getting angry with the interview, it just made them look a bit ridiculous. So I think there are those, and I think if you were in the 2010s in the UK, the idea that there would have been a kind of pretty militant strike wave involving a lot of different unions felt like it was not something that's possible. So I think that definitely demonstrates that there's kind of potential for unions. I think the other thing is, I think that Palestine solidarity has really shaped a kind of very much a resurgent form of labour internationalism, and I think that has been a really significant element. So if you go to, say, the demonstrations in Glasgow, a key constituent of those demonstrations is trade unions, and from many different sectors. So I think, and it's going back to your initial question, Chris. If you look at, say, some of the banners, one of the construction workers' banners, locals here has kind of an image of Palestine solidarity on its banners. So it's not something that's seen as a kind of over there necessarily in terms of some of our unions. It's seen as something that's really integral to the kind of culture of what trade unionism is about and is trying to kind of shape, I think.
Wow, very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, also I can see parallels elsewhere, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah, sorry, I know you asked a bit more globally, but I think...
No, I'm saying that's wonderful to give us also this image from the demos there. Chris?
Yeah.
Yes, so thank you, Professor, and also building up on the previous question. And with all the protests and strikes that are occurring more and more in recent years, I was curious to know on what advice would you give to activists or organizers trying to build meaningful and internationalist solidarities in today's fractured world, as explained in your book?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. I think it's in some ways not necessarily for me to answer that question, in the sense that I think I've got obviously lots of thoughts. I think I don't see myself as a kind of, in my role as somebody who can kind of tell people kind of what to do, because I don't think that's what I'm here for, in a sense. I think a couple of things that I think are important is to think about the terms on which links between different places are made. So, for example, I was talking about BDS, that I think it's important to take a lead from organisations like Palestinian trade unions rather than to kind of speak for them, though obviously the conditions organised in there are horrific. So it's not like, but I think that's important rather than kind of, I think there's a kind of slightly problematic history of say, particularly labour unions in the global north, kind of positioning themselves as people who have the answers and then kind of apply them elsewhere. So I think that kind of having that commitment to solidarity as a space of learning that goes in different directions, I think is probably the most important thing that I would say. But I think a lot of people have that. I think that's that common sense as a kind of way of organising.
Thank you.
Yeah.
David, what can we expect from you soon? I mean, what are you working on now?
Yeah, so in terms of what I'm working on at the moment, I'm working on two kind of related projects. And I'm not sure I can promise any of them soon, but I'm doing my best.
Sure.
So I'm working with two colleagues, Lazarus Kariotis, and and Ben Gowland. So we did a project on trade unions and spaces of democratization. So we're working on a book which looks at democratization from below in trade unions in Britain and Greece, Trinidad and Jamaica in the 1960s and 1970s. And there's quite a lot of maritime elements of that in different ways. So I'm working on the British element of that, and I'm working on the Seafarers Union, the NUS that were already mentioned, but in different ways, the kind of maritime aspects touches on the Greek work that Lazarus is doing, but particularly the case study union we're looking at in Trinidad is the oil field workers and their role in terms of kind of cutting into oil supplies and in relationship to things like South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement is really significant as well. So that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to kind of work on most at the moment. And then I've got a longer term project for a book which really would kind of try to bring together the work I've been doing for quite a number of years, basically in the early to mid 20th century on kind of maritime workers, labour, racialised labour kind of practices and anti-colonial politics. Mainly kind of using UK port cities like Cardiff, Glasgow and Liverpool as a kind of as a way to kind of then think outwards in terms of those linkages and stuff. So that's the core kind of things that I'm working on. But also just trying to get through the day. It feels like the pressures of the kind of work at the moment mean that it's a bit hard to kind of get sustained time to work on that. But I'm hoping to kind of, I'm definitely working away on them.
Great.
Yeah.
Looking forward to both of them.
Yeah. And how about yourself?
We're doing this podcast, and it takes a lot of time.
I can imagine.
But actually, it's fun. But this is part of a bigger project that at some point I wanted to discuss with you because I'm sure you have so many things to comment and to help us with. It's a project that seeks to somehow document and retell or reframe the sea as a space for community mobilization on different kinds of communities, from labor, as you in this case, but also other global South communities, or at least global South-oriented communities of revival, resistance, resilience, and also renegotiation of the relationship to the sea and through the sea with the social and political conditions of their livelihoods. So this is the main issue that the main frame practically that we are looking at, and we are trying also to get people like you on board who can help us highlight, give more depth to these approaches and bring, somehow a sustained body of information and scholarship to highlight all at the global level as possible. And well, that's the main thing that I'm working on. We also established here a lab. Actually, this work is part of a lab. We call it the Critical Ecologies Lab in the Mediterranean East. So stands for a regional lab that looks into how the region can also be rethought in more creative, in more also coherent ways. The region of the Mediterranean East, from the Arab but also the Balkan perspectives. So this is also something that we are very much interested in, and we'd like to create a series of lectures, maybe a series of of talks also on site that go also into this direction. So these are the main issues that the main fields of research at this moment. But yeah, mainly this podcast has kept us excited.
I can imagine it's kept you busy as well.
And I hope that this will also resonate with the audience out there. But with guests like you, I'm sure that this is guaranteed.
Well, hopefully, yeah.
So I want to thank you so much for being on board,
Thanks,
for accepting our invitation and giving us your precious time and your insights. And hope to see you actually soon. Finally, it's been a while.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah. Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Nicholas. And
thank you.
It's been a great. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Yep. See you
Cheers.
soon. Take care, David.
See you.
Take care. Cheers. Bye.
Bye bye.